It's time for us to check back in with Sidney Saylor Farr and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. Marriage and life after that. When the mountains spoke to my soul, I knew I was fated to hear them forever, no matter how far I wander from home. My parents took me from school when I was 11 years old and in the 7th grade. I never graduated from 7th grade. "You are only 11 years old, Sidney. You can't stop school now," my teacher, Miss Howard, said. "I have to, Miss Howard. There's no one to help Mama." "What's wrong with your Mama?" "Mama has a bad heart. The doctor ordered her to bed. I have to help." It became my lot to cook and housekeep for my family. I never got to attend classes again as a child or adolescent. I used to dream at night about being back in school, but that dream never came true. The nearest high school was 15 miles away, and there were no school buses at that time. I married shortly after I turned 15. There were no other options. I wanted to go back to school, but Dad said no. There was no money for me to be a boarding student at the Redbird Mission School or the Pine Mountain Settlement School. "You are needed at home to help your Mama take care of the youngins," he said. Dad worked as a timber cutter for the Ritter Lumber Company off and on until the first growth timber had all been cut and shipped out of the area. By then, when the Ritter Company relocated their mill, Dad was in poor health and not able to move his large family anywhere else. Around that time, when I was 14, Wilburn Helton, the brother of my best friend Tilda, came home from World War II. I fell in love with him. He had blonde hair and bright blue eyes. In his right cheek he had a dimple which came out when he smiled. For a day or two, Wilburn hung around our house talking to Dad. After he left one evening, Dad scolded me. "You made me ashamed of you the way you looked at him," he said. Later he told Mama, "She's growing up, Rachel. You better keep a sharp eye on her." Other young men began to hang around our house, but I was too naive to think it was because of me. Wilburn left the community to work in another state. Then we got word that he had married and fathered a son. I mourned for the loss of this first love. The last time I saw him was several years after he married and divorced. I was by that time married. Some of Wilburn's relatives lived just below our house on York Branch. Wilburn was visiting with them. 2 or 3 came out in the yard as he was leaving. I watched from my house as they all got into a pickup truck and drove away. That was the last time I saw Wilburn alive. Later, the neighbor said he had gone back into the Army and was shipped out to Korea. Before the war ended, he was killed in action. Leon Lawson, the man who became my first husband, was in the Navy during World War II. After the war ended, he came back to Stony Fork and his family, who lived on Birch Lick. I got acquainted with him at the post office, and he came several times to our house. He was a really handsome man, even more so when he smiled. I just wish he had smiled more often. He was quiet and serious, and he often would say cutting words about something or someone of which he did not approve. He had the reputation of being a hard worker and held others to his own high standards. He was also a talented guitar player. Leon and I went to church services a few times together, but mostly he came to the house and we sat on the front porch or in the backyard and courted. When he asked me to marry him, I said yes. I thought if I was ever going to have any life of my own, what else was there except to get married? I was 15 years and 3 months old on February 23, 1947, my wedding day. Leon was 25. It was a gray, cold day. The sky looked hard as slate, and you could see glints of frost in the air. My parents had to sign permission for me to get married because I was underage. Later, I was angry because Mama and Daddy had not had more foresight and had not taken better care of me. Why did they let me get married so young? But because most mountain girls married when they were 13, 14, and 15 years old, Mama and Dad didn't see anything unusual about it. We really didn't know the Lawson family that well, though, since we lived on York Branch and they lived on Birch Lick. Because our houses were in different valleys, we had little association with the Lawsons. On my wedding day, Leon's sister Helen and my Uncle Andrew, who had agreed to go as witness for me, accompanied Leon and me. Because Mama had so many younger children, it never occurred to me that she and Dad would go with us. We rode the bus to Pineville, our county seat. Back then, you applied for your marriage license and then immediately went to a justice of the peace and got married. That is precisely what we did. I wore a cotton dress with sprigged flowers and a blue sweater for my wedding. Leon seemed embarrassed. After the justice of the peace pronounced us man and wife, we walked out of the courthouse, and Leon and Uncle Andrew just seemed to disappear, leaving Helen and me. I remember it was cold and I was shivering because I was not wearing warm clothes. Helen and I walked down Main Street in Pineville and looked in the store windows. Then we started looking for Leon and Uncle Andrew. We passed a little restaurant, and through the window we saw them at a table eating. I felt embarrassed that my new husband hadn't said anything to Helen and me about eating. We went inside, and finally Leon looked up and said rather sheepishly, "Do you want anything to eat?" Helen firmly said yes, and we sat down at the table. It was a small restaurant, just 3 or 4 tables. I was so miserable I could hardly swallow my hamburger and Coke. Leon didn't say anything directly to me the whole time we sat there. He and Andrew talked. After that, we went to the bus station. While we waited for the Straight Creek bus, Alifair, a girl that I had gone to school with, came up to greet us. She came from a family whose older members had died from tuberculosis one by one. We talked for 4 or 5 minutes until the bus came. Leon said he reckoned we had better stay at my house because there was not much room at his parents'. It was the custom for young newlyweds to stay with their parents for a few weeks. There was 1 bed in our living room where Mama and Daddy slept, and 2 beds in the bedroom. The younger children piled up in 1 bed. I remember getting in the other bed that night, wishing somebody would tell me what to do. Things did not go well. The next day, suddenly, he decided we would go to his parents for a while after all. We walked a couple of miles up the road to Birch Lick. We came first to his Uncle Brad's house. Brad Lawson had married a young woman from across the hill when he was in his 40s. They had 4 or 5 children, little boys, I remember, just like peas in a pod. Leon wanted to stop and visit with Brad before we went on to his parents' house, so we stopped and stayed a while. Then he and Brad went off somewhere to another house in their community. I waited and waited for Leon to come back so we could go to his parents' house, all the time dreading it and wondering why he had gone and why he was staying away so long. Ethel, Brad's wife, talked to me and was very warm and welcoming, but I still keenly felt Leon's abandonment. I could not relax for even just a minute. Eventually it got dark and they still had not come back. By that time I had really began fretting. I said to Ethel, "Do you suppose he has already gone home and will expect me to come?" She calmly said, "Oh, I don't think so. Why don't you just relax and wait here until he comes for you?" Leon and Brad finally came back about 9 that night, and Brad said, "Well, you might as well spend the night. It's dark outside." So Leon and I spent the second night of our married life at Brad and Ethel's house. The next day we went on up to Leon's home. He had told me that his parents never spoke to each other and that they'd been married for a long time and had several children, but it was like they hated each other. I found Leon's family very strange. They greeted me when we arrived, though, and to my satisfaction, Leon's father seemed to like me. During the following days, he spoke to me more often than the others did. Leon had several younger brothers, and his mother was very pregnant. I remember thinking, well, they must communicate some way for her to be pregnant. We settled in for the night. I remember how lonesome I was. I listened to the ticking of the Lawson's grandfather clock and felt sad. Several days went by, and then one evening Leon went down to Brad's grocery store and didn't come back that night. I couldn't understand it. I was embarrassed that he would stay all night away from his new bride. Again, I laid in bed listening to the grandfather clock in the living room. Leon came back the next morning and didn't say a word about where he had been, and I did not dare ask. Helen and some of the younger boys had planned to go see a radio show put on by Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper and their band of musicians out of West Virginia. They were appearing at the school near the mouth of Stony Fork. Helen asked if I would like to go with them, and I said sure. She asked Leon to go, but he said no. He refused to tell me whether he thought I should go or not. I decided to go. We got ready and walked to the school. There was already a big crowd of people. I had listened to music shows on the radio many times, but had never seen a live performance. I thought they were wonderful and enjoyed them immensely. We got home that night to find that Dora, Leon's mother, had gone into labor and that Leon had asked Brad to take her over Birch Lick Mountain to the Red Bird Mission Hospital. Leon stayed at the hospital until the baby was born. My mother-in-law was 51 years old, but she had no trouble giving birth to her last son, and she was back home in a week. Then I got fever and chills. I had no idea what was wrong with me. I was sick a day or two, and then one morning I got up and had bumps all over my chest, throat, and face. Leon's mother recognized the symptoms. "You've got the measles," she said. I was sick in bed for 2 weeks. Before I recovered, Leon's brothers and sisters started coming down with it one by one. Even the new baby got the measles. Dora said I had brought the measles in on the family. I felt terrible and extremely blameworthy. Sometime later, I heard that Alifair, the girl I had talked with at the bus station, had had measles. I must have caught them from her. I tried to apologize to Dora, but she just sniffed and left the room. It seemed to me it took all that winter before the last person in that house got better. Leon acted indifferent to how I felt. By the time we had recovered from the measles, Leon had made arrangements for us to live in an old house that was down the creek from where his parents lived. Some of his family had lived in that house years before. I remember that it was a nice, big house with several rooms. In fact, it was so big that in the winter we shut off part of the house to conserve heat. But I didn't like living there, for I always felt afraid of something intangible. The floor would creak and a door would close by itself. Now that I'm older and more sure of myself, I would like to live in that house again. But back then, when Leon wasn't home, I was frightened to stay there by myself. Of course, nothing ever happened. When springtime finally came, delightful plants sprouted up all around the old place, and it was an adventure to see what would come up where and try to identify it. There was also fruit trees and a garden. That first summer, we planted vegetables and I picked blackberries. I canned berries and apples and made sauerkraut and pickled beets like my mother had always done. We lived there for a year, and then we bought a house and a small bit of ground, just flat enough to have a garden on. We lived there for a year, and then we bought a house and a small bit of ground, just flat enough to have a garden on York Branch. From this little house, I could look across the creek and see my parents' house on the hill. Mama and I could stand out in our yards and holler back and forth to each other. The house we moved into was just a one-room house built with rough lumber. The roof leaned all in one way, high in the front and down in the back. It had windows at eye level that opened and closed. For a while we lived in that one room. In the wintertime we had a warm morning heating stove in one corner of the room, our bed in another corner, and a wood-burning cook stove in the third corner. The homemade kitchen table stood in the center of the floor. Leon got a job at the William Ritter Lumber Company and began earning money. For the first time, I knew the joy of having more than one new dress at a time. We bought a set of pretty new dishes with peach blossoms around the edges. They were beautiful. Leon had to walk to work, which meant that he had to leave when it was just barely daylight. I'd get up at 4:30 in the morning to bake biscuits and fix a hot breakfast before he left for work. I knew that I would have the whole glorious day to myself. That summer, I began listening to soap operas on the radio. I would rush out in the morning to pick beans and gather other vegetables for supper. I prepared the vegetables when the radio dramas came on the air. I appreciated the little bit of freedom I had living away from my childhood home and at least somewhat on my own. I always found it exciting to listen to the radio. I imagined what the different actors looked like as they talked and tried to envision everything about the setting. It was much more exciting to listen to the radio and imagine what things looked like than it is to see everything on TV today. Eventually, Leon was able to get some lumber and materials to add on a room to our house. His dad and other men in the community helped to build a kitchen onto one side of the house. It was great to have a kitchen. Then after that, he built a porch across both rooms so that we had a front porch. Later, he boxed in half the porch. This new extra room was just big enough to get one double bed in. You could barely get around the bed. A door opened out onto the porch and one opened from the kitchen into that room. That room became my refuge. Sometimes at night I'd wait until Leon went to sleep, then I would ease out of bed, go into that room, and stuff towels around the door so that the light wouldn't shine through. There I would read for hours. By that time, the Redbird Mission bookmobile came to Stony Fork every 3 weeks. Sometimes I would listen to the radio, but I had to keep it turned down so low I could barely hear it. I was always afraid that it might awaken Leon. Almost from the beginning, my husband abused me verbally and physically. If I tried to express my opinion, and at the least hint of arguing with him, even if it was just to pacify or explain, he would slap me and tell me to shut up. I could never win an argument because the more I stood up to him, the more violent he would become. So early on, I began to withdraw to a place inside where his blows and words no longer had power to hurt me. I was ashamed for anyone to know about my fantasy world and how Leon treated me. Soon enough, however, my family and friends became aware of how things were between us, since he would scold and belittle me in a lordly sort of manner in front of them, but he would physically abuse me only at home. Missionaries and books. After all is said and done, the mountains are still there. They are the backbone of my life. At times I yearned to know what lay beyond the mountain ranges. I dreamed of cities, towns, lakes, and oceans, which I'd only read about in books. When missionaries from the Evangelical United Brethren Church at the Redbird Mission in Beverly, Kentucky came to Stony Fork to hold Sunday school classes on Sunday afternoons, I felt blessed. This was my first experience with people from outside the region, and they changed the world for me. I thought they were perfect. The Redbird Mission had centers in several other communities that they called outposts: Beach Creek, Middle Fork, Jacks Creek, and Mill Creek. They opened a center at Stony Fork in 1949. The preacher at the Redbird Mission Church, Reverend Ira Wilson, and 2 high school teachers, Iona Windland and Hazel Richer, arrived and began holding Sunday school classes in the one-room schoolhouse. Leon and I started going to the services. It gave us something to do, and there were no regular church services in the community at that time. We and our neighbors filled the one-room school every Sunday afternoon, where we were divided into classes. I was learning a lot just by associating with the missionaries and seeing how they related to other people and to each other. After a while, though, I began to feel ashamed of my mountain ways in the presence of the missionaries, ashamed of our poverty and lifestyle, which seemed so different than theirs. I worked hard to talk like they did and grew obsessed with making myself commendable and worthy so as to be accepted by people who were beyond the hills. By that time, I had decided that if I were to live in a big town or city someday, I would need to talk and act like city folks did. This annoyed my family and friends. They accused me of trying to get above my raising, of being stuck up, and of throwing away my heritage for a more cosmopolitan style of life. Little did they know that I was even more driven to get above my raising than they even imagined. At the Redbird Mission, Esther Elmer was the high school librarian. The mission outfitted a bookmobile, and she began traveling up and down the hollows around each outpost. Esther came to Stony Fork every 3 weeks. Patrons were allowed to check out 3 books at a time. Gradually that changed when she realized how much and how quickly I would read the books I borrowed. So she started bringing extra books just for me. She asked me to read them and tell her if I thought they were the kind of book that she should carry in the bookmobile. This gave me the chance to read all kinds of books on all kinds of subjects. I gladly read them all and dutifully reported to Esther. In one carton of books Esther brought me was a magazine containing an advertisement about the American School in Chicago. It said students could take high school courses by mail. I was excited by that ideal, especially when I read that the school was accredited and one could take college preparatory courses from them. I wrote the American School for more information. They replied that it would cost $198 for 3 courses per semester and that payment could be made by installments. I wanted to enroll more than anything. There just had to be a way. Around that time, a full-time minister was sent to Stony Fork. Morris Ballman arrived with his wife Kathleen and their 2 children, Sandy and Danny, in 1950. They rented a storefront house alongside the main road that went through the community. The building, with its sloping roof, had been hastily built. At one time, it had been a store where you could get gasoline or kerosene and groceries. The house had no electricity and no running water when the minister and his family moved in. I felt sorry for Kathleen because she looked too fragile to be the mother of 2 children, to keep house, and to help her husband in the church. I prayed that the minister's wife would be able to read music and could give me music lessons. I played music by ear on a reed organ I had bought from a neighbor, but I wanted to learn to read music so that I could play songs I had not even heard before. After the Ballmans arrived and we got acquainted, I found out that Mrs. Ballman could read music, but could not play very well. She used one hand, playing only the melody and the alto part of hymns. Still, she agreed to teach me at no charge if I would promise to play the piano for Sunday school and church. I agreed and further vowed that if she gave me lessons, I would learn to play using both hands. I went to Kathleen's house once each week for lessons on her piano. At home, I only had the reed organ on which to practice. Then one week, Reverend Ballman drove to Ohio and brought back a truckload of used pianos, one for the church, one for me, and several for some neighbors. Leon, who liked music, was very supportive of my getting the piano. He even paid the $40 charged to help pay the expense of the trip. My friend Tilda, who bought one of the used pianos, also wanted lessons from Mrs. Ballman. I was still waiting to enroll in the American School. How could I pay for it? I went to Mrs. Ballman and asked if I could do any work for her. After thinking about it, she said I could do her ironing. This was the day of cotton and almost everything had to be ironed. She said she would pay me $3 a week. I wrote the school asking if I could pay $3 each week by installment. They agreed and I enrolled. Doing the Ballman's ironing turned out to be a terrifying job for me. I was accustomed to using irons heated on a stove, but the Ballmans had a gas iron. Its pilot light, when lighted, burned with a blue flame that bubbled and hissed all the time. After a year or so, the mission told us they had plans to build a new church at Stony Fork. The mission leadership said they would match us residents dollar for dollar in getting the church constructed. They told us that the congregation could work on the construction and they would figure out what our contribution was according to how many hours we worked. This seemed like a really good deal. Dad, Grandpa, and some of my uncles all helped. The mission decided the church should be built of native stones gathered from the creek. I remember Dad with his horse pulling sleds of rocks. There was a lot to do and quite a few people worked on the church. This mission brought in a man from near Toledo, Ohio to supervise the building project. He had spent his life as a builder. He volunteered his time to come and supervise the construction. I liked him, but Leon was possessive and jealous if I even spoke to this man or any of the other workers. At home he would slap me or yell ugly names at me, claiming he had seen me looking at them. My friends who hear this part of my story inevitably ask why I stayed in the marriage. My answer is that there was no work for women, and I had no place to go. All I could remember at the time was Grandma Saylor saying, "You've made your bed and you have to lie in it. There's nothing you can do." The music lessons gave me something else in my life, and Leon was proud that I was learning to play piano. It was one of the few things that I ever did on my own initiative of which he approved. He played the guitar and sometimes in the evening would play and sing, and sometimes I would sing along with him. But for some reason I never tried to play my piano with his guitar. A local preacher who had a radio ministry over the Pineville radio station asked Leon and me to sing and play for his program. We began practicing in the evenings and on weekends. We sang for our church services first, then we went to do the radio program. We began getting invitations to sing at other church services, revivals, and funerals. The funerals were difficult, especially when the deceased had left specific requests that we sing certain songs at the funeral. I enjoyed everything about our singing together. I would have to say that those times of traveling and performance were the happiest times we spent together in our marriage. Leon, who usually criticized everything I did not criticize my singing, which encouraged me. We became well known in the region for our singing. I also did some songwriting. During both World War II and the Korean War, mothers hung stars in their windows to denote how many sons were in service. I wrote a poem entitled God Had a Son in Service and sent it to a radio program called The Midday Merry-Go-Round, which was broadcast over station KNOX in Knoxville, Tennessee. One particular group, Carl Story and the Ramblin' Mountaineers, liked my poem and composed music for it. They made a recording of the song, and I heard it played on several local stations. I even received 2 royalty checks. Together, they amounted to $150. I was well pleased. Leon hated my reading books. Many times he jerked a book out of my hands, ripped the pages, and threw it into the fire. Because of this, I was afraid to tell him when I enrolled in the American school. I knew he would forbid me to do it. For a while I managed to keep my school books hidden from him, but one day when I was away from the house, he found where I had hidden them. It was winter time, and our warm morning heater was keeping us warm. How easy it was for him to burn those books. I was desperate when I returned home and discovered what he had done, and I wondered how in the world I could ever replace them. Finally, in desperation, I wrote a carefully worded letter to the school. I never told a lie if there was any way around it. I wrote that my books had been destroyed by fire. A person from the school wrote back to express their condolences for my homes having burned, and they replaced the 3 textbooks without charge. At this point, I told Leon I was taking correspondence courses and why. I said if he ever touched another one of my books, I would make him very sorry. I finally had mustered the fortitude and stood up to him about this. I was firm and quiet on the outside, but inside I was boiling mad, just daring him to ever destroy another book. After that, he left my books alone. Of course, there were other things to keep me busy. Our little house on York Branch had no running water. I had to go down the road a quarter of a mile where someone had put a pipe into the hillside where there was a natural spring. I would go down, fill 2 buckets with water, and carry them home. I asked Leon repeatedly to dig us a well close to the house so I wouldn't have to carry water. He always promised that one day soon he'd get started. Finally, after hearing one day soon once too often, I said, if you're not going to dig a well, I will. Leon laughed. While he was at work that day, I got a shovel, marked off the place in the yard where a well would be handy, and started digging a hole. Every morning after breakfast and household chores were done, I would go out and dig before the sun got up high and hot. Day after day I dug, and day after day Leon would taunt me. When are you going to reach China? I was stubborn and would say to myself, it doesn't matter what he says, I will do this one way or another. Pretty soon the hole was waist deep. Then when it got still deeper and I was still digging and shoveling, Leon got worried because I didn't know anything about how to shore up the walls. He hired a man in the neighborhood to finish digging the well. Eventually 2 more men came to help, and they took turns digging. When the hole got very deep, the men reached some clay-like rocks which they would pitch up and out of the hole. Some of these rocks would have imprints of leaves and ferns on them. They were beautiful. I marveled at the thought of how many millions of years ago those plants had been alive. I kept some of the rocks for a long time. Eventually the workers struck water and it came in strong and cold. I was so happy. They shored up the sides and built a wall about 3 feet high on top of the ground. They put a pump in and then cemented rocks into place so that the top was smooth all around the well. All I had to do was go prime the pump until water gushed out, and I had all the water I needed. Up until this time, we did not have electricity. It wasn't until the early 1950s that our house was finally wired. On the day that Princess Elizabeth was crowned Queen of England, I remember listening to the coronation ceremony on my battery-operated radio. Men were stringing electric wires into the house. We finally had electricity. We'd bought an electric wringer-type washing machine, and the first thing I did once we had electricity in the house was get water from the well, heat it, and do a load of laundry. It was wonderful to watch the machine run by itself and to feed the clothes into the wringer. And all of this on that famous day. I listened to the radio the whole time. Of course, we also quickly bought other electric appliances, such as a refrigerator and an electric radio. Back then, in 1953, there was still no television. Having electricity and water in and near my house turned out to be great because now I had a baby. So we'll stop right there. Another fascinating look into Sidney Saylor Farr's life. A kind of a sad one, though. Sad that she ended up marrying a man who was mean to her, who obviously didn't understand her. Makes me wish I could go back and tell that young Sidney, give her some advice, when she says that he said his mother and father never spoke to each other, they hated each other. I wish I could tell her, if he come from a family like that, he may be like that too. Children learn what they live, sadly. Even in, I wish it wasn't like that, but when children are raised in homes that are bad, often they have those same tendencies. They don't even, it's not that they want to, it's just what it is, just one of those things. Granny has a poem framed in her living room that's like children learn what they live. It's a very famous one. You may be familiar with it. But I wish I could go back and tell her and give her some advice, because it's so sad that she had to go through that. Really, amazing for us to think about how pleased, I just can't imagine if every time I needed water I had to walk that far and carry back 2 buckets. How blessed I am to have water out of every faucet in the house. But all those harsh living conditions, we just can't even imagine that today, the way that people had to live there. Even thinking about the small houses with all those kids, all those different things. It's just such a different time than we live in today. I do think the part about church is interesting, regular church, and then the missionary type people that were helping them. In those days, there was just not much entertainment, so lots of people went to church. Even people, obviously, like her husband, who was not listening to the word, was not learning, or he wouldn't have been smacking on his wife at home. But still, that was entertainment. You got to go and see people and talk and be part of whatever was going on. So I think that's important. It's a weird connection there. He was going to church, and yet he was really mean to his wife. A really weird juxtaposition, I guess you would say. But I think that because that was such a form of entertainment for people, I think that's why necessarily, and I guess it could still be like that today, some people's not necessarily going to church to worship, they're going for different reasons because of that kind of social gathering, so that part's interesting. I like the part about Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper. You can find them on YouTube if you'd like to go hear them. I like the part about them being at the school just because I've heard stories. Pap's told me a story like the Chuck Wagon Gang and Jim and Jesse and obviously Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper, different people like that. In those days, there wasn't as many, if any, like big auditorium think places. So a lot of times they come to little schools. So he's told me stories about people that even come to the school that I went to school in. My elementary school, Martins Creek School, is no longer there now. It burnt down. But if you're a local and you was ever in that old school, then you could imagine being in that gym and thinking, there was a concert in here. It was so small, so tiny. But I like that part just because of those memories of I like both sides of it. I like people like Pap and Sidney getting to go see them. Pap told me one time they took Gazzy with them, Granny's mother, and she went and she just loved it. But also the singers getting to travel around. There's no big tour buses in those days. They were just traveling around in their cars to these little small places and performing for people. So I like both sides of that. I guess this was such a sad part because you feel so sorry for Sidney having to suffer through all that stuff and not being prepared to be married and then having a bad marriage. But I guess the part I like the best is her strength throughout it, that stubborn streak that she was going to read the books and she was going to try to better herself by learning. and she wasn't going to give up on that, and how she didn't know how she was going to figure out how to get the money, but she was going to go to school, and she did. She figured out how to get the money, worked it out so that she could get them, and then even managed to get the books replaced when he burned them. So I really love that part. And then the well, I just love that she's like, well, I'm going to dig it. I'm going to, I'm just going to do it. She was just determination, that perseverance that you can see all the way through the book played such a role in her life. In this part of the book, you especially see it. We've seen it in some of the other parts, but you especially see it through here, just that real persevering attitude that she had, that she was going to figure it out, and she did. The one part about the missionaries is kind of strange. You can see, though, why she would try to be like them, why she'd start talking like them and want to be like them, and I can also see why her family and her friends said, well, you're being stuck up, you're ashamed of us, and you're trying to be like them. So I can kind of see both sides of that. But obviously today, looking back, hindsight, she did not forsake her heritage. She spent the rest of her life kind of promoting it and celebrating it, all her wonderful books, and preserving it. So many stories and things. Even this book that we're reading is just a snapshot of her life in Appalachia. So all those stories, the ones we read from her grandfather and her father, she just documented so many things for everyone. So you can see she obviously did not turn her back on her heritage, but I can kind of understand how she was wooed by them and how they seemed to have it all together and were really nice, and like she said, she thought they were perfect. Of course, we know no humans are perfect, and I'm sure they weren't trying to act perfect. It's just that she was so impressionable and probably so hungry for somebody to actually show her some care and some love. So that probably played into it as well. I hope you enjoyed this peek into Sidney's life, even though this was kind of a sad part. I hope that you'll leave a comment and let me know what jumped out at you. And as always, I hope you'll drop back by next Friday, because we've got to see what happens next.